The bullet that should have killed me never made a sound. No crack of gunpowder, no whistle through the air. Just the sudden burn in my shoulder and the taste of copper flooding my mouth as I hit the desert floor. They found me 3 days later, half buried in sand. My lips cracked open like dried leather. The doc in Silver Ridge said I'd been talking in my fever dreams, screaming about shadows that walked without footsteps, and a killer who never missed. That was 5 years ago, and I'd tried to forget. Built myself a quiet life shoeing horses and mending fences, convinced myself it was all delirium from blood loss and sun madness. Then yesterday morning I found the calling card on my porch, a spent cartridge with no powder residue, placed right where I'd see it. The same signature the silent death left on all his victims. My hands haven't stopped shaking since, because whoever put that cartridge there wants me to know something I've spent half a decade trying to deny. I didn't survive by luck, and the man who shot me isn't finished with whatever twisted game he's playing. What you're about to hear isn't some campfire tale or dime novel fiction. This is the account of how I became the only living witness to the West's most feared assassin, a man who turned killing into an art form so precise, so silent, that most folks didn't believe he existed until they were already dead. Before we ride into this darkness together, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button, because this story spans deeper than one telling, and you'll want to hear every chapter. Slam that like if you've got the stomach for the truth about what really happened in the territories. And drop a comment telling me what country and city you're watching from. I want to know how far this legend has spread, and whether the silent death's shadow has reached your corner of the world too. Now let's begin where it started. The town of Redemption, summer of 1882. Redemption wasn't much to look at. Just another dried-up collection of wooden buildings clinging to existence in the New Mexico territory, the kind of place men pass through on their way to somewhere better. I'd been working as a deputy there for 8 months, which was 7 months longer than anyone expected me to last, considering I was only 23 and greener than spring grass. Sheriff Dalton kept me around because I could read and write proper, something he couldn't do without squinting like he was staring into the sun. The morning it started, I was sitting outside the jail with my boots propped on the rail, watching dust devils dance in the street. Old Mary Hutchins was hanging laundry across the way, and somewhere behind the saloon a dog was barking at absolutely nothing, the way dogs do when they've got more energy than sense. That's when the stranger rode in. Except he didn't ride so much as materialize, his horse walking so quiet you'd swear its hooves were wrapped in cotton. He was tall, dressed in black from his flat-brimmed hat down to his boots, and he moved with the kind of stillness that made you think of deep water. I felt it before I understood it, that animal instinct that tells you when something's wrong, when danger's wearing a human face. The dog stopped barking. Mary Hutchins froze mid-reach for a shirt, her hands suspended in air like she'd forgotten how arms worked. The stranger dismounted in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon and tied his horse with movements so economical, so practiced, they looked like choreography. His hands never strayed far from the twin revolvers at his hips, weapons that gleamed dull in the sun like they'd been used recently and cleaned with care. Sheriff Dalton emerged from his office behind me, and I heard his breath catch. A small sound, but in that moment of unnatural quiet, it might as well have been a shout. "Jesus and Mary," he whispered, and his hand dropped to his gun belt, then stopped, trembling there like it couldn't decide between drawing and praying. The stranger looked at us then, really looked, and I felt my guts turn to ice water. His eyes were gray as tombstones and just as warm, and when they fixed on you, it was like being measured for a pine box. He smiled, not friendly, not mean, just a slight upward curve of his mouth that said he knew exactly how this day would end. "Sheriff Dalton," the stranger said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clear across the 40 feet between us. "Been looking for you." He didn't draw his weapons, didn't make any threatening move, just stood there with his hands loose at his sides, waiting. That's when I noticed the silence wasn't just quiet. It was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant sounds of life continuing elsewhere. It was like the whole world had drawn a breath and forgotten to let it out. And in that suffocating stillness, I understood why they called him what they did. Death had come to redemption, and it had arrived without making a sound. Sheriff Dalton's face went pale as old bone, and I watched a bead of sweat trace down his temple despite the morning still being cool. "You've got no business with me," he said, but his voice cracked halfway through, betraying the lie we both knew it was. The stranger tilted his head slightly, like a hawk studying a field mouse before the dive. "Abilene, spring of '78. You remember Abilene, don't you, Sheriff?" Each word came out measured, precise, like he was carving them into the air between them. I'd never seen Dalton look afraid, not when we'd faced down drunk cowboys shooting up the town, not when that gang of rustlers had threatened to burn us out. But now his hand shook so bad on his gun belt that I thought he might drop his weapon before he even cleared leather. "That was different," Dalton said, his voice barely holding together. "That was war business, territory disputes. You can't hold a man accountable for—" But the stranger raised one finger, and Dalton's words died in his throat like he'd been strangled. "I don't hold anyone accountable for anything," the stranger said softly. "I'm just a messenger, Sheriff. Someone paid for a message to be delivered, and I always fulfill my contracts." He paused, and that terrible smile returned. "The client was very specific about wanting you to know why." My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my hand had found its way to my own revolver without me consciously deciding to move it. Everything in my body was screaming at me to do something, draw, shout, run, but I was frozen, watching this dance of death play out like I was nailed to my chair. "Deputy," Dalton said without taking his eyes off the stranger, "this ain't your fight. You go on inside now." His voice had found some steel again, that old authority creeping back in, but it was fragile as sun-dried leather. I should have listened. God knows I should have stood up, walked through that door, and let whatever was coming happen without me. But I was young and stupid, and thought being brave meant staying put when smart men ran. "I'm not leaving you, Sheriff," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. The stranger's eyes flicked to me for just a moment, 1 second of attention that felt like being touched by winter itself. "Loyal," he said, and somehow made it sound like an insult and a compliment at once. "Your deputy has spirit, Sheriff. Pity about what's going to happen to him." Then everything happened at once and in slow motion. Dalton drew, his hand moving faster than I'd ever seen, clearing leather clean and bringing his Colt up level. But the stranger was already moving, his hands flowing to his guns like water finding downhill, and I saw the muzzle flash from his right-hand revolver. Except there was no sound, no thunder of gunpowder, just a flash of light and Dalton spinning backward with a hole in his chest, blood spreading across his shirt like spilled ink. I was drawing my own gun, screaming something I don't remember, and then fire exploded in my shoulder, and the world tilted sideways as the silent bullet found me too. I hit the wooden planks of the boardwalk hard enough to knock what little breath I had left clean out of my lungs. My gun clattered away somewhere to my right, spinning across the boards like a child's toy, useless as my rapidly numbing arm. The pain came in waves, hot, then cold, then hot again, and I could feel blood pulsing out of the wound in rhythm with my heartbeat, each throb reminding me I was still alive even though I probably shouldn't be. My vision blurred and sharpened like I was looking through water that wouldn't stay still. Through the haze, I saw Sheriff Dalton on his back in the street, his eyes staring up at nothing, his chest no longer rising. He'd been talking to me about his daughter just that morning, little Sarah, who'd be turning 7 next month and wanted a pony more than anything in the world. Now she'd be wanting her father instead. The stranger's boots appeared in my swimming vision, black leather polished to a mirror shine despite the dust of travel. He crouched down beside me, those tombstone eyes studying my face with what might have been curiosity, if anything human lived behind them. "You're tougher than you look, Deputy," he said, his whisper somehow cutting through the roaring in my ears. I tried to speak, to curse him, to ask him why, but all that came out was a wet, gurgling sound that scared me more than the bullet had. Blood was filling my mouth, and I realized dimly that the shot must have done more damage than I'd thought. Maybe clipped something vital, maybe punctured a lung. The silent death, I finally managed to choke out, spraying red across the boards beneath my face. That's what they call you. It wasn't a question, just a fact I needed to say out loud before I died. Like naming the thing that killed you gave you some power over it. His smile widened just a fraction. They call me many things in many places. That's one of the more poetic names, I'll admit. He reached out and wiped some of my blood off the boardwalk with one gloved finger, examining it in the light like it was something precious. Special ammunition, custom made by a gunsmith in St. Louis who asked too many questions and had to be silenced himself. The powder burns cold and quiet, barely any sound at all, just enough force to kill. I could hear shouting now, people emerging from buildings, the spell of silence finally broken. Mary Hutchins was screaming, someone was yelling for the doctor, but it all sounded far away, like I was at the bottom of a well listening to the world above continue without me. The stranger stood, holstering his weapons with that same economical grace. You'll live, deputy. The shoulders are clean through and through, missed everything important. Consider yourself fortunate. I aimed to wound you, not kill. He tipped his hat, a gesture so absurdly polite given the circumstances that it felt like mockery. We'll meet again, you and I. I'm certain of it. Then he was walking away, moving through the gathering crowd like smoke through fingers. And nobody stopped him, not the bartender with his shotgun, not the 3 cowboys who'd been playing cards in the Silver Dollar, not anyone. They just parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses, and he mounted his horse and rode out of redemption at that same silent walk, disappearing into the shimmering heat waves rising off the desert. I lay there bleeding into the boards, watching him vanish, and somewhere in my fading consciousness I understood that he'd let me live for a reason. I just didn't know yet what that reason was, or how much I'd come to wish he'd killed me clean instead. I woke up 3 days later in Doc Morrison's back room, the smell of carbolic acid and laudanum so thick I could taste it through my cracked lips. My shoulder felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through it and left it there to rust, and every breath sent fresh needles of agony shooting down my arm. The doc was sitting beside my cot, his spectacles perched on his nose, reading a week-old newspaper like he had all the time in the world. When he noticed my eyes open, he folded the paper with deliberate care and leaned forward, his weathered face creasing into something between relief and concern. "Welcome back, son. You gave us quite a scare." My voice came out like gravel scraping over metal. "How long?" It was all I could manage, my throat raw as sandpaper, but Doc understood the question beneath the words. How long had I been hovering between life and death? How long had the town been without law? How long since the stranger had ridden away? 72 hours, give or take. You lost a considerable amount of blood, and the fever had you talking all kinds of nonsense about silent guns and shadows. He poured water from a pitcher, held the cup to my lips with steady hands. The bullet went clean through like he said it would. Whoever shot you knew exactly what he was doing, placed it precise as a surgeon's cut. The water was the best thing I'd ever tasted, and the worst, because it meant I was alive and would have to live with what I'd witnessed. "Dalton?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, had known it the moment I'd seen him fall with that impossible silence ringing in my ears. Doc's face went hard. "Buried him yesterday. Half the town turned out, even folks who'd complained about his drinking or his rough ways with prisoners. Sarah was there. Sweet child, wore her Sunday dress and didn't cry once, just stared at that coffin like she was trying to understand how her daddy could fit inside a box that small." He paused, removing his spectacles to clean them, though they didn't need it. "Her mother's taking it poorly. Real poorly. Guilt crashed over me like a flash flood, hot and suffocating. I should have done something different, drawn faster, aimed better, thrown myself in front of Dalton, anything but what I'd actually done, which was get myself shot and watch a good man die. I failed him," I said, and the words tasted like copper and shame. "You're alive," Doc said firmly, and there was steel in his voice I'd never heard before. "That stranger could have killed you easy as breathing, but he didn't. He wanted you alive, deputy, and until you figure out why, you've got a responsibility to keep breathing and thinking. He stood, moving to the window to stare out at the street. Territorial Marshal came through yesterday, asking questions. Seems Sheriff Dalton wasn't the first lawman to die by silent bullet in the last 6 months. That information settled into my gut like a stone. This wasn't personal revenge. It was methodical, planned, a pattern that stretched across the territories like a spider's web. How many? I asked, pushing myself up despite the screaming protest from my shoulder, needing to sit upright for this conversation, needing to feel less like a victim, and more like someone who could still fight back. Doc turned from the window, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. 7 confirmed dead in New Mexico and Arizona territories, all lawmen, all killed with those strange quiet bullets, all shot by a man dressed in black who rides in, does his work, and vanishes like morning mist. He moved back to my bedside, placing one weathered hand on my good shoulder. The marshal says there's been talk of this assassin for years. Stories from Texas, rumors from Kansas and Colorado. They call him different names in different places, but the method's always the same. Silent, professional, unstoppable. He squeezed gently, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that demanded attention. You're the first person to survive an encounter with him and live to tell about it, Deputy. The Marshal wants to talk to you when you're strong enough. Says you might be the key to finally stopping this devil before he kills again. Marshal Crawford arrived the next morning while I was forcing down eggs and weak coffee that tasted like dishwater, but at least stayed in my stomach. He was a lean man in his 50s with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by one more wounded deputy. But he listened when I talked, which was more than most lawmen would have done. I told him everything. The absolute silence before the stranger appeared. The way animals and people alike seemed to freeze in his presence. The conversation about Abilene that Dalton had nearly broken down hearing. Crawford took notes in a leather journal with handwriting so neat it could have been printed, never interrupting, just letting me pour out every detail while Doc Morrison hovered nearby like a worried mother hen. When I finished, Crawford closed his journal and studied me for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable as carved stone. You're fortunate, son, not just because you lived, but because you actually saw his face clear enough to describe it. Most witnesses, the few who survive, only catch glimpses, shadows, nothing concrete enough to build a case on. He pulled out a folder stuffed with papers and photographs, spreading them across the small table beside my cot like a gambler revealing a losing hand. That's Thomas Brennan, railroad detective, shot in El Paso last March. That's Deputy Lewis Harding out of Tucson, killed in his own office in July. Sheriff William Cross from Silver City, found dead in an alley with no witnesses and no sound heard by anyone within 3 blocks. Each photograph showed a different man, different circumstances, but all shared that same detail. Clean bullet wounds, no powder burns, nobody who'd heard the shots fired. My hands were shaking as I looked through the photographs, seeing the pattern Crawford had laid out before me like pieces of a gruesome puzzle. They were all lawmen, I said slowly, my mind working through the implications. But what connects them? Why these specific men? Crawford leaned back in his chair, and I saw something flicker across his face. Frustration mixed with admiration for a question he'd clearly been asking himself for months. That's what we can't figure. Some were clean as Sunday morning, others had checkered pasts. Some were young like you, others near retirement. Different territories, different jurisdictions, no obvious connections. He tapped one photograph, a heavy-set sheriff with kind eyes and a drooping mustache, except for one thing we discovered 2 weeks ago. He pulled out another document, this one older, the paper yellowed at the edges. It was a military roster from what looked like the Civil War era, names listed in fading ink alongside unit designations and ranks. Crawford's finger traced down the list, stopping at names I recognized from his photographs. They all served together. Company K, 3rd Colorado Cavalry during the war and after in the territories. They were part of something called the Sand Creek Detail. The name meant nothing to me, but Doc Morrison made a small sound like he'd been punched in the gut. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "The massacre, Sand Creek Massacre 64. I'd heard rumors that some cavalry units were involved in cleaning up afterward, making sure no witnesses survived to tell different stories than the official reports. His face had gone pale as milk. That's what this is about? Revenge for something that happened 20 years ago? Crawford nodded grimly. We think someone's paying for justice, or their version of it. Every man on that roster who's still alive and findable has either been killed already or is marked for death. Sheriff Dalton was number 8. We've got maybe a dozen names left, scattered across 4 territories. He looked at me directly, and I saw the weight he was carrying in those hard eyes. The stranger you met, we believe his name is Josiah Crane, though he's used a half-dozen aliases. Former Union sharpshooter turned assassin for hire. Best in the business and the most expensive. Whoever wants these men dead has deep pockets and a long memory. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker, as the full scope of what I'd stumbled into crashed down on my shoulders heavier than any bullet wound. He said we'd meet again, I told Crawford, and heard my voice shake despite trying to keep it steady. Before he rode out, he said he was certain of it. Why would he say that if I wasn't even his target? But even as I asked the question, a cold certainty was forming in my gut. Josiah Crane had let me live for a reason, had marked me somehow with his attention, and whatever that reason was, it meant my life had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. Crawford's expression confirmed my fears before he even opened his mouth to speak. Because, Deputy, he said quietly, you're bait. He's counting on you trying to stop him, counting on you warning the others on his list. And when you do, when you lead us straight to his next target trying to save them, he'll be waiting to finish what he started. That was 5 years ago, like I told you at the start. 5 years of watching shadows, of jumping at sounds that weren't there, of wondering every single day if today would be the day Josiah Crane came back to collect whatever debt he thinks I owe him. Marshall Crawford died 2 years back. Natural causes, they said, though I've learned not to trust coincidences anymore. The roster names kept getting crossed off one by one, silent bullets finding their marks in places scattered across the West, like a trail of breadcrumbs leading nowhere and everywhere at once. I left Redemption eventually. Couldn't stand the pitying looks or the way Sarah Dalton would stare at me in the street, like I was a ghost that should have died instead of her father. Tried to build that quiet life I mentioned, shoeing horses and staying invisible, hoping maybe Crane had forgotten about me or finished his contract and moved on to other killing work. Then yesterday, that cartridge appeared on my porch. No powder residue, just like the bullets that nearly ended me, and I understood something I'd been too scared to admit. He never forgot. He's been watching all along, waiting for the right moment to finish whatever game he started in that dusty street in Redemption. So now you know why my hands shake, why I sleep with a loaded gun under my pillow, why I'm telling you this story instead of keeping it buried where it belongs. Because Josiah Crane is still out there, still killing with that terrible silence, and I'm the only man who's looked into those tombstone eyes and lived to warn others. If you hear stories about lawmen dying without a sound, about an assassin dressed in black who moves like smoke, believe them. And if you're wearing a badge and you once served in the territories after the war, check your past real careful, because the silent death doesn't forget, doesn't forgive, and doesn't miss. And somewhere out there in the vast stretches of the West, he's already drawing a bead on his next target, finger tightening on a trigger that won't make a sound when it finally sends another soul to judgment. The story of the silent death continues, but whether I'll be alive to tell the next chapter, well, that depends on how fast I can ride and how well I can shoot when he finally comes for me again.